Hello guys, welcome back to the channel, and today we are continuing this series with NHL teams that have the brightest future. It'll be myself alongside Gio, leggorocks99. Make sure to check him out if you haven't already. He's one of the better hockey YouTubers in the game today. Comes out with more content than I could even begin to comprehend. This guy knows everything regarding prospects and just everything regarding the league overall that normally basic hockey YouTubers aren't covering on a daily basis. Great content and an even better person. Make sure to check him out, guys, if you haven't. But we will be discussing the LA Kings, and this is a team that I've been wanting to break down with for quite some time now, as they have one of the best prospect pools the NHL has to offer, and it's surely going to be getting better before it gets worse in LA. So we'll be breaking down everything there is to know about this Kings team, what has happened with them over this past year, summarizing their offseason for the most part, their draft, their entire prospect pool, and while everything shapes together for them to have such a promising future. But if you end up enjoying this video, make sure to hit like and subscribe. As always, guys, it means a ton. Help us get 2K subs. We were so close there, but I know we will get there because you all are amazing. And without further ado, guys, let's get right into this video.
What's going on, Tyler? It's our first time ever collaborating here on YouTube. It's a pleasure to be on the YouTube channel. I could not have built myself up a better plug. You must be my secret hype man in disguise. So I really appreciate the kind words. But yes, I'm leggorocks99. I do my own stuff here on YouTube. Lots of talking about NHL news and prospects. And, you know, sometimes on our channel, we love to cover stuff going on with the Kings, which is why when Tyler asked me to be a part of this for the LA Kings prospect pool, talking about their future, I just had to say yes. So Tyler, let's get into some Kings prospects, shall we?
Of course. All right. So let's talk about the Kings before we get into their prospects, because I have more than I can even count currently in front of me. When we look at their offseason, we know they didn't do anything drastic. They're coming off of a season where really they never fully committed to a rebuild, even though all indication is that they've done just that. They were one of the worst teams in the NHL this past year, end up getting a top 3 pick, which becomes, of course, Quinton Byfield, and we will expand on that plenty. But if you look at how they did this past year, a mix with just some youth and a lot of veteran leadership in that lineup still, as they have to deal with some hefty contracts with their key guys in those runs in 2012 and 2014. Kopitar leading the way in points with 62 points. He still has 10 mil on his contract for another 4 years, and it'll be interesting to see if he does in fact finish his career with LA. And then you have guys like Alex Iafallo, who I've been a big fan of. He's really surprised me over these past couple of years in that increased role in that top 6. 43 points for them. Dustin Brown, the former captain, 35 points, and has a cap at of 5.87 mil for another 2 years. So big contract. Could the Kings deal it? I'm sure they would love to deal it, but it's a matter of how can they with the modified no trade clause. Drew Doughty, 35 points, such a controversial player, and I don't mean that to offend any Kings fans watching this, obviously. There's just been a lot of discussion with him, especially with the list that just came out with the NHL Network's top 20 defensemen, where they feel Doughty is put, as he has another 7 years at 11 mil AAV. So he's a very interesting guy who still has a full no move clause until the 2023-24 season. So it'll be interesting to see. He's in the same boat to Shea Weber, if you will, just with such a long-term and high AAV deal. Even though it's not to Weber's caliber when it comes to AAV, it's still huge in its own right, even worse. And then you have guys like Adrian Kempe, who really stood out to me a couple of years ago. He's regressed slightly in his game, but I think that definitely goes in hand with how the Kings have played over these past couple of years. Had 32 points on the year. Jeff Carter, injury prone, 27 points, 2 more years at 5.27 mil. Sean Walker, a strong season for the young defenseman, taking advantage of that top 4 role for the LA Kings, 24 points. And then you have other guys, whether it's, Blake Lizotte with 23 points, Matt Waugh with 18 points, Michael Amadeo, 16 points, Ben Hutton, who I know you know plenty of as a Canucks fan, and he's another guy where he's definitely decent, in my opinion, on that bottom pairing, but given the Kings' lack of depth on defense, he's obviously gained some significant playing time, and it could result to some rather head-shaking things that happen. 16 points. Then you have another guy who I want to know your thoughts on, and that is Nikolai. I'm going to pronounce his last name wrong. Could you do the honors? It's It's Prohorkin?
Oh man, yeah.
Yeah, because he only played 40 plus games with the Kings this past year. 14 points on the year. I'm curious to see what ceiling he has, if anything, because he's a guy who I don't have nearly as much of a familiarity with as I do with other guys in this lineup. Then you have Trevor Lewis, the veteran, 12 points. He's been with them through it all. And Trevor Moore, who I forgot about for a while, was part of that deal going the other way to the LA Kings. I hope he gets an increased role next season. Had 12 points, had 5 points on the year in 15 games. And then the goaltending situation, which I am enticed by with guys like Cal Peterson, who surely looks like to hopefully be that next number one, assuming that Jonathan Quick, say, doesn't take the bulk of the work next year. Maybe they split time more 50-50 with Jack Campbell out of the equation. Had a goals allowed average of 2.64 and a save percentage of 922 in just 8 games, but still promising for the young goaltender. Then Jonathan Quick actually had a pretty strong season given everything that was going on with the team in front of him. 42 games played, a goals allowed average of 2.79 and a save percentage of 904. 5.8 mil for another 3 years. Yes, he's on the wrong side of 30, and yes, he's been injury prone, but still a solid year for Quick with really a subpar defense in front of him. So just on the forefront, what are your thoughts on really what has happened with the LA Kings this past season?
Well, when it comes to the Kings, they are indeed a team that people weren't really expecting them to be amazing. Let's just be very clear about that. Even with some of their signings that they did, we mentioned the Nikolai Prohorkin. He was a guy who was very good in the KHL as one of their top forwards for SKA St. Petersburg. Signed over a 1-year contract to come over to LA. Did pretty decent, 14 points, 43 games played. That's not terrible. But the fact is, he's 27 years old. He is inactive at the moment. No contract for this guy right now. So what the Kings were doing last year was they were pretty much just icing a team. That's probably one of the biggest things that they wanted to do heading into this season was just actually have a team that could play some games. And afterwards, when they got rid of some of their key guys at the trade deadline, like, for example, Tyler Toffoli, sending him to the Vancouver Canucks, they really put an emphasis on some of the younger, more talented players they have deeper within the pipeline and gave them an opportunity to really showcase themselves off. First off, you got Tyler Madden back in the Tyler Toffoli trade, who I know he didn't play for the Kings last year, but he is still a very good prospect. But what you did when you opened up that space with Tyler Toffoli out of the lineup was you put in Martin Frk and you had Gabriel Vilardi as well. These guys came together towards the end of the year. They won LA a whole bunch of games, scored a whole bunch of points. As a result, the Kings kind of went out with a bang in 2019-20.
Yes,
I think
did.
winning their last 6 games or something like that. It was quite wild. And as a result, they pushed themselves further back in the standings, but we all know what happened in hindsight because that pick that wasn't one of the bottom 3 picks ended up winning second overall. So overall, things were very good for the LA Kings towards the end. You got a really good showcase out of Gabriel Vilardi. He's probably one of the more NHL-ready young guys in the system. And also for Martin Frk, a guy who is on a $725,000 deal. He displayed very well when he was up here in the lineup. So for the Kings, obviously it's easy to see that their best days are going to come ahead rather than today. They had some success with those Drew Doughties, Kopitars, Carters, and all that back in the early 2010s. But they're a team that's got $10 million of dead money tied up in Ilya Kovalchuk, whose termination will give them a 6.25 cap hit until 2021. And Dion Phaneuf has that $4 million cap hit for next season as well, plus $1 million in 22 and 23. So they're going to have some opportunities to really bolster up what exactly it is they're doing into the long-term future. But for now, it's kind of the, we want to ice a team. We want to just remain competitive. We're not in it to win it just yet. But there are so many pieces in this system that I think you could take a look at and say, yeah, they're going to help them out sometime down the line.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I just want to touch on Martin Frk for a second, because I do believe over the past year, he broke the AHL record for hardest slap shot. Am I correct?
He did.
I forget the exact speed, but it was impressive. I remember,
and it was faster than the Weber one too.
Yeah, I think it beat Chara's. It was ridiculous. I don't know if it was closer by a couple inches or whatever, but I saw that was a fun stat. But nonetheless, yeah, no. When you look at the Canes, obviously they aren't in a win now stage, and they shouldn't be. And they're really doing something that Chicago, you can make the argument, should have started really around the same time, at least a year or two ago, given how they're currently in. So from a rival standpoint, the Canes are definitely have a one-up on them in that aspect. And what you look how they have done just over these past 2 years since 2018. I have a list of their top prospects in front of me. We have 11 prospects here, and all of them are at least second round picks since 2018. So first and second rounders. So you have guys that say aren't just necessarily blossoming from, say, being a stretch in the 4th, 5th, plus 6th round. These are all higher grade prospects that have plenty of potential and for good reason. And for the most part, outside of, say, a couple that we will get into, have really went beyond expectations at this point, at least, or have been on the perfect track to stardom sooner rather than later. And as you touched on, yes, they currently have like 13.6 million cap space, and I do believe that they have 9 picks currently going into the 2021 NHL draft, with a couple picks in the second and third round draft, which will be huge because next year's draft will be just as important, maybe not as important as this year's, but there's a lot of great guys, and over these next couple of years, the Canes are probably going to be in a spot where, you know, a couple years down the line, we're going to see one of the best draft classes like ever outside of this one. Regarding, why am I blanking on the two guys' name? Could you help me out quick? They're both 15. Why am I blanking on their names right now?
Oh, 2015?
No, they're both 15 years old currently.
Oh, is this for 2022?
I think 2022, 2023.
Right, or okay, 2023, Mishkov and Bedard.
Yeah. Okay. So the Canes will probably be competing by then, but they still may be in a spot where they are still having that possibility of, say, snagging some good picks. Like, as a Rangers fan, look at how the Rangers did this past year. They had no business getting that first overall pick, and let alone they did. Now, I know the circumstances were different, but the Canes could find themselves in a similar situation where they say maybe just miss playoffs, and they could very well end up with a top 3, top 5 pick, which could be crucial for them coming that draft. But nonetheless, let's get into these prospects exactly and why their future is so coveted, because there are a lot of teams that have great prospect pools right now, and a lot of them have great ones with already a strong roster. Now, the Canes do not fare as well in that aspect of their overall organization, but they do have easily a top 3 prospect pool, if not top 2, in the NHL today. So let's start off with a guy like Akil Thomas, because he's one that I think really gets forgotten about, and that from everything that I've seen, he has been dealing with some injuries, so I understand that that definitely goes in part with it. But originally drafted in the second round, centerman, 20 years old, 6 foot, 180 pounds. In the OHL last year, in just 22 games played, he had 40 points, including 9 goals and 31 assists. The year prior, 44 points, and 2 years ago was his peak, at least in juniors, at 102 points, playing for the Petes, and since then has been with a different team now, if my memory serves me correct. So what are your initial thoughts on Thomas? Because he's a guy who very well could see himself on the outside looking in it, if you will, with this center depth, especially in this prospect pool.
Akil Thomas was a guy that I was really surprised to see drop to 51 overall back in the 2018 draft. You noted his 102 points, 63 games played, and then the next season, his 2 points a game campaign, 84 points in 49 games in the entirety of the season. He also scored some big goals for Team Canada at the World Juniors, which was awesome to see. But Akil Thomas, as a guy who is just at that 6 feet tall mark, is indeed a guy who a lot of people kind of harped on for not being like, you know, a big power forward kind of like player. He was only 180 pounds as listed here on HockeyDB. So pretty average sized guy, but he was a really quick, really shifty, really skilled playmaking player. And I was very surprised to see this guy slip down there. Honestly, to me, I see him as a potential middle 6, maybe even a top 6 caliber center, a guy who could demand some second power play time on a really good team. And overall, it's just a really nice piece to have, especially as a guy that you picked up over there in round number 2. There certainly were some worse picks you could have made at that 2018 second round spot. So Akil Thomas definitely, to me, is a great one.
Yeah, I think when you look at the Canes just on the forefront with how they've fared in the second round over these past couple of years, it's been nothing short of fantastic. Especially, and we'll get to him next, staying on this trend. One of my favorite prospects that they've had ever since they drafted him was Arthur Kaliyev. When Kaliyev fell to the second round last year, I was baffled. That was really one of my first years in taking a deep dive in prospect pools. That's really even before I was having my channel or anything like that, but I was really breaking down and getting an idea as to, okay, who are some of the better goal scorers in this draft? And outside of guys like Cole Caulfield, obviously, Kaliyev was right up there. He had a 50-plus goal season, and it was looking like he was surely going to be a first-round pick. But no, he falls in the second round to the LA Kings, just in the second round. I think it was 33rd overall. Kaliyev,
Mhm.
however, has not skipped a beat. The right winger, left-handed shot, 6'2", 190 pounds. He's only 19 years old still. Had 44 goals, 54 assists for 98 points in 57 games in the OHL this year. And in his draft year, obviously, had 110 points in 67 games. Kaliyev is quickly emerging as one of the top and upcoming prospects for the LA Kings, and truly looks like he could be in their lineup maybe in a couple of years. It's one of those situations where, okay, he's not undersized, so you can't use that excuse against him as to why he fell out of that first round. I have heard some things about him when it comes to his two-way game that maybe it was slacking a little bit. That could have
That's
led to
yeah.
him falling. And that very well could be the case. But again, just from without even watching any of his highlights, and I have watched plenty, just his statistics alone would make you suggest, okay, how this guy fall to second. So what are your thoughts on Kaliyev, and how do you see him impacting this LA Kings roster really as part of their core group going forward?
I'll answer the second question first. Arthur Kaliyev is the best goal scoring player in the prospect pool when it comes to upwards potential.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. At the 2018 draft, he was to me the second best goal scorer of the draft, but the best shot. I thought that his shot was better than Cole Caulfield's, but Cole Caulfield to me was a little bit more of a cerebral, kind of shifty, finding open space kind of goal scorer. Arthur Kaliyev was just the guy who you give the puck to, he grips it, he rips it, it's back in the net right there. He was a guy who a lot of people really harped on because he didn't really back check, and his overall play in his own zone wasn't really all too great. Plus the attitude issues that people were at least leaking out into the media that suggested that many scouts didn't even really have this guy in their top 30, as would have been suggested by the actual draft spot that he was at in the 2019 NHL entry draft. And you're exactly right about that. He dropped down to the second round, 33rd overall. He was a guy who a lot of people said had first round caliber talent, potentially even top 10 talent. It's just what goes on up here is so important. And it's why people kind of dropped him down in the rankings. I saw some people saying things like, if Arthur Kaliyev just had the work ethic as a Peyton Krebs, for example, this guy would have been a top 5 pick in a draft that included Bowen Byram, Kirby Doc, Turcotte, and of course, Kako and Hughes. Kaliyev has some very, very raw tools, but as a guy who has indeed exhibited that he doesn't really need to have the best overall reputation when it comes to his two-way game to produce points, as you said, 98 points in 57 games this season at the World Juniors with a really weirdly coached USA team. He was at 4 goals in 5 games, played 6 points on that squad too. So obviously the best is yet to come with Arthur Kaliyev. And as this guy either goes back to the OHL or maybe he comes on to the Ontario Reign system. Actually, no, I think he will be in the OHL, either there or in the LA Kings if they decide to give him a chance. Maybe that 9-game little tango over there. He's definitely a guy who his better days are ahead of him. And if this guy can take his goal scoring ability, his overall powerful shot, his ability to just find that spot right in the net that's open, this guy's going to go a long way, whether that's a number 1 goal scorer in the AHL or a 25, 30 goal guy in the NHL with a number 1 power play right wing spot. I think the future is bright for Arthur Kaliyev. And even though he does have some other things that people were saying, okay, maybe this is why he's not really worth it to take a chance on in the first round, at the end of the day, you're still taking a chance on what is probably one of the best goal scorers we've seen in these NHL drafts as of late.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And he's a guy where, assuming that he continues to progress the way he is and he finds that maturity level, and when it comes to the stigma behind players that are, say, more one-dimensional, if you will, I'm never too caught up in that, especially with younger guys like Kaliyev, for instance, and the same argument can be had with guys like Patrik Laine today. And it really baffles me because these guys are so young, even with an established guy like Laine, not to really branch out there, but these guys have so much time to develop, and at the end of the day, if they stay closed-minded, then it's surely going to affect their play, and you're going to realize it sooner than later. I don't think that's going to be the case for a guy like Kaliyev either, and it reminds me in a sense where, like, as a Rangers fan, thinking of a guy similar to his build and has similar shot with being a bona fide goal scorer, it reminds me of Rick Nash more in his time with Columbus, where he wasn't defensively sound the way he was until he transitioned with the Rangers, but he was a prime example of really not becoming a two-way forward, really having a decent to strong game until he came over. It's when he played in Team Canada with Mike Babcock and he started using him on the penalty kill. That really took a turn for him, and he was a late bloomer in that aspect, if you will. So Kaliyev is only one of many guys who could very well blossom in the NHL entirely as more one-dimensional and then just casually transitioning his game as he gets seasoned in in the league as year goes by. So again, Kaliyev, I do expect a lot from him. I'm really excited for his future, and the LA Kings definitely lucked out landing him in that second round. But next up,
Agreed.
we have Rasmus Kupari, and he is a controversial guy because if you look just, say, a year and a half ago, you'd say Kupari is, without a question, one of the Kings' best prospects. And while I agree he's definitely one of their better prospects, he has fallen off a little bit from everything that I've seen, at least, and I'd like to see your initial thoughts on him. The centerman, originally drafted in the first round back in 2018, 20 years old, 6'1", 188 pounds. In the AHL last year, in 27 games played, he had 9 points, including 6 goals, 2 assists, and 8 points total. So that definitely goes in hand with believing that, okay, things didn't transition well. I can say a lot about that as well, and I'll have you talk first. And then last year with Liga, he had 33 points, I should say, in 43 games. So not bad at all. But what are your initial thoughts on Kupari? Do you think that this is something we should take more with a grain of salt, as he's just trying to get his feet wet in North American ice? Do you think it's much to worry about, or do you think it's a situation where, okay, he has been struggling heavily to find his game at the North American level?
Well, it wouldn't be a lie to say that he has been struggling, because that definitely has shown off in the numbers. I do want to focus a little bit more on the World Juniors performance, because he was an alternate captain. He played one game before suffering a knee injury, which ended
Correct.
his season. He was a guy who I honestly, you do see sometimes the odd player who comes into the AHL who doesn't really show all too well in year one, but then eventually is able to bounce back. Obviously, not everybody's like that. Some people just stay in the not so great range. But for Rasmus Kupari, a guy who just recently turned 20, he was 19 when he was playing in the AHL in his debut year. I definitely do want to give this guy the benefit of the doubt. The fact is, he was a very, very good point producer back in the Finnish Liga. And for the World Juniors back in 2019, he had 5 points in 7 games played there as a guy who was a little bit on the younger side. So for Rasmus Kupari, I'd be willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, just saying, okay, let him heal up his knee, come back to form full speed ahead, and actually showcase what he can do at a more mature 20 years old rather than the 19 he was back when he had 8 points in 27 games played for Ontario. But Kupari, to me, first round talent. Obviously, he was taken in the first round in 2018. Very nice, shifty, skilled offensive player. Taking a look at the scouting report here on Elite Prospects, take a look at this. Mikko Manner said this in 2017. He is a mix of Jesse Puljujarvi and Sebastian Aho. And that's a very, very high piece of praise for anybody to receive, let alone this guy back when he was not even drafted. This is from the head coach of the Karpat team. So obviously there is still, to me, a buildable skill set around Rasmus Kupari, but it really depends on how he's going to have to bounce back from that knee injury, because, athletes' knees, sometimes they can be really, really detrimental if they do get the bad side of a knee injury.
Correct.
So for Kupari, I think we're just going to have to wait and see. Obviously, I don't want to say it's a little bit more guaranteed or less guaranteed than others, but he certainly does have a buildable NHL skill set. It's just we have to wait and see on how he recovers from the knee injury.
Yeah, and that's definitely a good factor to take into consideration, because it's one thing if, say, a guy gets hurt, but when it is the knee especially that has been detrimental to certain players, or at least delaying their progression into becoming an NHL player, no question about it. And regarding injuries, we'll get to him in a second, but Vilardi is a prime example of overcoming them, but it's still no easy task. He went through so much hurdles in order to get to where he's at currently. But next up, we have a guy that you definitely know plenty on, and that is Tyler Madden. When that trade first happened with the Vancouver Canucks, I know it feels like a broken record for you, but we're going to turn it back on anyways. It looked good at first. No doubt in my mind. I thought that was a smart move for Vancouver. And while, yes, there is that risk of it being a rental, it wasn't like the Canucks were giving up, say, their most prized prospect, which is something that some teams that are more desperate to compete in playoffs are willing to do. But Madden is a guy who, even though he is smaller stature, he's only 150 pounds at 5'11", so he needs to bulk up quite a bit. He has a lot of pure skill. And on the forefront, he seems to me with a guy that currently has the potential to really be, I'd say it's probably pushing it to say a second line center. I think definitely bottom 6. Third line center is probably his best bet at the NHL level as of now, and I'll gladly be wrong. But the 2018 third round pick, 20 years old, 5'11", 150, as I said, playing for Northeastern this past year at 37 points in 27 games, 10 points over point per game, 19 goals, 18 assists, and had 28 points a year prior in 36. So he's been pretty consistent. So what are your thoughts on Madden? Because obviously I know you would love to have him back in the Canucks system as you're a Canucks fan, but he is a guy who is an interesting spot given the fact that, yes, the Kings, similar to the Sens, obviously have so much depth at center in this prospect pool. So where could he find himself lining up? And that's why I'm definitely pushing more so in a bottom 6 spot for him long term.
I would have said top 6 would be a very good achievable, probably like a top end ceiling for Tyler Madden, depending on the team that he plays for. But of course, when you're behind Gabriel Vilardi, Quinton Byfield, Alex Turcotte, we'll get to some of those guys a little bit later, in your own team's depth chart, it's going to be tough to crack a top 6 role with those guys on the team. But Tyler Madden, as the son of former NHLer John Madden, has really developed his overall two-way game as well as that offensive flair. Very skilled, very shifty. He's got a great shot. He's got a knack for finding people who are open, but he also plays PK as well. And he's a very skilled two-way center, despite only being 5'11", 152 pounds. It's kind of funny because I'm here in Vancouver. So when the trade went down, sending him over to the LA Kings for Tyler Toffoli, a lot of people that I knew said, oh, yeah, like it's a great trade. Tyler Madden's not going to be anything. He's only 5'11". He's only 152 pounds. What's this guy going to do at the NHL level? But at the end of the day, the NHL is really going more towards that speedy, quick, shifty kind of game and less of the physicality, big, tough guy, strong enforcer kind of game. So if there's a time for a player with Tyler Madden's stature to start becoming successful and start paving his way into the NHL, it's now. And he's a guy who has really just overall blossomed, took over the Northeastern University Huskies program. As you said, 37 points in 27 games played. And sure, the Vancouver Canucks only drafted him in the third round, so at the end of the day, it technically was only a third-round pick they gave up for Tyler Toffoli. But when you're in a position where you take a third-round pick and you turn him into somebody that a lot of people were saying 2 years down the line, okay, if we redrafted 2018, Tyler Madden would probably be a first-round talent just from his overall production as a Northeastern University Husky, and you trade him away for a rental, oh man, that kind of stings a little bit. I know I'm getting off topic talking about the trade, but at the end of the day, I think it's a big testament to just how much faith Canucks fans had in Tyler Madden. And as a guy who we saw grow from a USHL scorer after his draft year to a very good Northeastern player, potential Hobey Baker candidate, it really does sting my heart quite a bit.
and I completely understand that. There's always that worry just as a fan where you're kind of not necessarily going all in, but you're addressing things for a team that, when we look at the forefront for the Canucks, and not to expand on them, but they weren't a team that was expected to have a deep playoff run as it is. So they definitely went beyond expectations. Toffoli had a very strong stint, even though it was a short stint. He definitely played well during his time with Vancouver. So I don't fault them there in that aspect. Obviously, it would have been nice to lock him up. But going back to Madden just a little bit more, I completely agree. His two-way game has progressed tremendously over this past year, especially. So that's a huge aspect of his game, because when you're talking about one-dimensional players, for instance, you have a guy like Madden who, yes, he is basically undersized. He needs to get some weight on. But the fact that he is defensively sound, his size shouldn't, that factor won't matter nearly as much as long as he really showcases himself. Like, look at Elias Peterson, for example. Yes, he's taller, but he's scrawny. We know this. But he has a fantastic two-way game, as we both know. And that doesn't really, that really goes in hand with how great of a player he is, and why his size and, his lack of weight, for instance, is not an issue for him. We could see a similar scenario to Madden just in that aspect. Not really much of anything else, because they are polar opposite players besides their two-way game. But going past Madden now, we get to one of the best, if not the best prospect, arguably, for the LA Kings, and that is Samuel Fagemo. He's a guy who doesn't get enough credit at all, in my opinion. He's a stud. Originally drafted in the second round back in 2019 by the Kings, a right winger. 20 years old, 5'11", 194 pounds. In the SHL this actual year thus far, in 12 games, has 6 points, including 3 goals and 3 assists. This past season, however, the 2019-2020 season, he had 22 points in 42 games in the SHL. And I believe he's not actually, I believe he's playing, is he playing in the SHL this year, or is he playing in just the league under?
He's playing in the Allsvenskan, the AHL of the SHL.
Yes, but nonetheless, Fagemo is a guy who is easily getting overlooked because of just these great forwards on the forefront, with bringing in Byfield and obviously having Turcotte there too. There's a lot to be happy about in Canes land, but he's a guy who definitely deserves a lot more credit. So what are your initial thoughts on Fagemo, and where could you see him wind up in this Canes lineup, and when?
Fagemo is a really interesting one because he was actually eligible for the 2018 draft.
Mhm.
But as a guy who wasn't really all too great in the SHL, he had 2 games played, he had 0 points. Obviously, very small sample size, I get it. He also played in the Allsvenskan where he only had a goal. He went undrafted in his first eligibility year. But his second year saw him as a very regular Frölunda Hockey Club top six forward. He got selected in the second round there by the LA Kings. And now, as you mentioned it, he's just been turning heads. At the World Juniors, this is where he really came out to play and he put his name on the map. Fagemo, Niels Höglander, these two were the duo over there for Team Sweden. 13 points in 7 games played. He was one of the best overall players at that World Juniors tournament. And in fact, he was a guy who just put himself even further into that spotlight. He's a guy who got a whole bunch of stuff. He was a top 3 player on his team as awarded by the Swedish, what was it? Like the coaches, I think they're the ones who vote on that. And he also led the entire tournament in points too, over Barrett Hayton, Lafreniere, Grigory Denisenko as well. So even though he was a guy who was a year removed from his draft year when he was drafted, he still is indeed a player who boasts a very good offensive skill set. He's a dynamic hockey player, top 6 upside, as many people have labeled as an overall goal scoring player. But for Fagemo, I think because he is a little bit on the older side, he is 20 years old, even though he was drafted in 2019, I could see him making an impact in the AHL, the Ontario Reigns, sooner rather than later, whether that's this year after he gets taken out from his loan, I guess, from the Söderstad Hockey Allsvenskan team, or sometime next year after playing another year in Sweden. I think we have a little bit of a shorter time frame towards seeing Samuel Fagemo on North American ice, but I'd be very excited to see what exactly happens when that does occur.
Yeah, he's a guy that I'm definitely a little bit more excited about than, say, some others. And nothing against, obviously, the Byfields and the Turcottes, for example, but we pretty much have a decent idea as to what to expect from these guys sooner rather than later at the NHL level. Fagemo is more in a class of his own as to with a lot of question marks, and I'm awfully curious to see what he's going to do just on the North American level, see if he can light it up, if he does in fact start in the AHL in say a year or so, and then go from there. But I'm very excited for him nonetheless. And now let's get to a guy where he obviously made his start last year, Gabriel Vilardi. What a start he has had to his career, and what a rough one it has been at the same time. Centerman drafted in the first round back in 2017, 21 years old, 6'3", 201, is the prime definition of what the Canes have stood for back in their runs in 2012 and 2014. Bigger bodied forwards, especially centermen, that have great grit, a strong two-way game. That is Vilardi, and he's going to be fitting in perfectly with the era of the Jeff Carters and the Andrzej Kopitars of the world, really reaching the end of their primes now. But Vilardi in the AHL last year in 32 games played at 25 points, which was very strong, 9 goals, 16 assists, and also had a cup of coffee towards the end of the year with the Canes. And I was watching plenty of those Canes games today and up late. 7 points in 10 games, including 3 goals and 4 assists. Strong numbers there for him, and he also had 1 point in the AHL last year as well. And I believe I actually had that stat messed up. But nonetheless, a lot of things. Oh, I'm sorry. He had 1 point in 4 games in the AHL a year ago because of his injury. So that's really
that's all
what
he played.
So if you want to expand on his injury a little bit more, please go ahead. But Vilardi is a guy where he makes so much sense for the Canes, and I'm so happy that he is healthy and he has rounded out his game. And the fact that he made that kind of impact towards the end of the year, because when you get that kind of stint, for the last 10 to 12 games, you need to make the most of it if you're really trying to leave a lasting impression. So you basically have one up on the guys. And look, it's not like he's with a team that has a depleted prospect pool. He's going to have plenty of competition come training camp time. So he definitely put himself a step ahead than some other guys. So I'm happy for him. I really hope to see him succeed in the top 6 role with the Canes next year. But what are your thoughts on Vilardi?
Yeah, well, when you talk about the injury, man, we spoke about knee injuries earlier with Kupari and how that's difficult to recover from. Let's talk about Vilardi for a little bit. This guy got a back injury that sidelined him for a whole year. That's a whole year's worth of prospect development at, how old was he? 19 years old? Gone. That's incredibly important. When you're a young guy, you're not even 20 years old yet, you're in the position to becoming a top NHL caliber prospect. when you get taken away your 19-year-old year like that, you only play 4 games. Sure, you're playing in the pro level, but you got taken away an entire year's worth of development. That sucks. That really does suck. And for a guy like Gabriel Vilardi, who a lot of people said could have been a top 3 pick back at the 2017 NHL entry draft, but then he slipped all the way down to 11. The guy was touted by many as, the next Jonathan Taves, the next two-way center of the future, very efficient game, two-way caliber, offensively capable guy. But the Kings took a swing on him. And as you mentioned, it's the play style, it's the overall identity as a player that really meshes in with what the Kings have built over the past few seasons. But as the end of his season came last year, where he was brought up, he played with Martin Frk towards the end, 7 points, 10 games. He put himself in a position where everybody was taking a look at it and saying, yeah, this is the guy that we saw drafted back in the 2017 draft. He's come back, he's overcome those hurdles, and now, hopefully, he stays in the league full time, plays 82 games. Hopefully, there are 82 games in the next upcoming season. But if there are, then I hope he plays all of them. I hope he gets a look on the power play, on the PK. Allow him to really show off all the strengths that he has, because Gabriel Vilardi, to me, has always been a guy who I've been cheering for. And I think, he scored a goal in his first shot or something in the NHL. It was something wild like that, and I saw Twitter absolutely going ballistic. So if we can keep those good vibes coming, just actually allow this guy to develop and not have him missing out on years worth of development like he has in the past, that'd be great. But Gabriel Vilardi, to me, I think he's an elite center player, or potential player at least. But as we said earlier, it's going to be tough to crack the number 1 center spot when you're competing with Turcotte and Byfield. So yeah.
I think what is so important to look at too of Vilardi and his development is when you look at two guys that are basically the next big things to happen for the LA Kings. And ironically, at the center position, it is not just him, but it is Quinton Byfield. The Kings have lucked out to put themselves in a spot where they really have their replacements for Carter and Kopitar perfectly. It really doesn't get much better than that. And yes, they're still going to be around for a bit, especially Kopitar. He's probably not going to be dealt. But regardless, it's going to be great for both of them, as they are going to be under the wings of these two with so much experience and similar playing styles in a lot of ways in their heyday. So to bring those two guys, especially in the forefront, two bigger bodied centermen that have a strong defensive game as well, it doesn't get much better than that. So I think that's what's most exciting. And when you also look at the Kings too, there are a lot of teams regarding their prospect pools where, yes, they may be star-studded, but they don't necessarily have that kind of balance of talent and grit. The Kings match off a lot of these boxes, in my opinion, with some of their higher elite prospects, which is really important to have that diversity. But getting on now to the next prospect I want to talk about, and that is Tobias Bjornfot. And he is a very interesting defenseman, and he's definitely climbed up the ranks over this past year for the LA Kings. Originally drafted in 2019, first round, 19 years old. He's 6 foot 205. In the SHL this year to date, in 6 games played, he has 1 point. The year prior, this past season, really, he had 13 points in 44 AHL games, and he also had 3 games in the NHL. So he just had a short stint towards the end of the year, like Vilardi, but less. But Bjornfot is a guy who, yes, the LA Kings don't necessarily have a stellar prospect pool when it comes to their defense, but he is definitely a guy to highlight as one of those next big names sooner rather than later, as they definitely need help on that defensive front. And they're in a situation where Bjornfot can hit that NHL level as maybe a mainstay as soon as next season. The fact that he got a taste leads me to believe he's definitely going to be competing for a spot. Time will tell, obviously, but what are your initial thoughts on Tobias? Because he's a guy that I don't have necessarily as much familiarity on as the majority of the prospects I have presented in front of me.
Tobias Bjornfot isn't really somebody that you put out there to get a whole bunch of points. He's mostly a two-way guy who plays a very capable shutdown game and also can transition the puck towards the offensive zone. He was a guy that a lot of people were really surprised to see the Kings take 22nd overall, because I think according to consensus, he was supposed to be a second-round guy. But the fact is, the LA Kings had themselves a second first-round pick that they acquired in the Jake Muzzin trade. They already got themselves Grundstrom and Dursey from that trade, so they got themselves an extra second to burn, and they took a chance on this Tobias Bjornfot, who ended up making the team immediately after training camp. He was actually playing with Drew Doughty starting off the season in the preseason. He had a cup of coffee, 3 games played. He was a -4, so that's not all too great, but at the end of the day, 19 years old guy, or excuse me, he was 18 at the time, getting his first taste of NHL action after being a 22nd overall pick. It's pretty impressive. And as a guy who did go back over to the AHL, he started playing a little bit more with the Ontario Reign. 19 points, 44 games, as you said. He played 7 full games for Team Sweden at the World Juniors, 0 points, but that's not really his forte. He was known mostly as that guy who will come in here, probably have himself a top 4 ceiling at best, minutes eating, not really a point per game nearly kind of guy, maybe not even half a point a game in his career, but overall just a solid defensive presence that you have. And you don't really see too many of these guys who have a spotlight that Tobias Bjornfot has, because most flashy defensemen who have themselves the spotlight, it's like, okay, Quinn Hughes, who's a very good point per game defenseman with Michigan. Same thing with Cale Makar, and then Heiskanen, who was a point per game in the playoffs. You got yourself some very underrated guys who don't really put up the points, but who can be very strong two-way players, and that's kind of what Tobias Bjornfot is to me. I wouldn't be surprised if he made the team full-time next year, probably as a bottom 6, maybe a bottom-line penalty kill kind of guy, but we'll see, because there certainly is a big future for the 19-year-old Tobias Bjornfot, for sure.
Yeah, no, and I think that was definitely a great way to touch on him. Definitely not, from everything I've seen, there isn't a stellar amount of offensive potential, and that's still something that could present itself as he develops into his NHL career with such a star-studded offense that is surely going to be in front of him over these next 4 or 5 years. But now getting on to one of the obvious prospects in Alex Turcotte. Alex, I believe he is a Chicago native, is he not? Because I believe
yes, he is.
I believe when I was watching the draft last year and everything leading up to it was like, okay, come on, the Blackhawks need to land him here, and they take Kirby Dach. That was the biggest smack in the face that I've ever seen in a while to a prospect. So then when you see Turcotte land to their rival in the LA Kings, I was like, oh, okay, this is definitely going to be a redemption story here. Turcotte, drafted in the first round 2019, 19 years old, 5'11", 185, played with the Wisconsin Badgers this past year, and everything went wrong for the Badgers. Keandre Miller, as a Rangers fan, he didn't have a bad year, but not a stellar year. Cole Caulfield still had a strong year, and Dylan Holloway was in there. It seemed like they almost had too much star-studded personalities in there that they just couldn't gel. They couldn't get things to where they wanted it to be. But nonetheless, Turcotte still had a strong year in his debut season with the Badgers, having in 29 games played, having 26 points, just under a point per game, including 9 goals and 17 assists. And then in the USHL the year prior, he had 34 points in 16 games, which was going into his draft year, obviously. So Turcotte is a guy that really has all the tools to be that number 1 center for the LA Kings, should they go that route. But they also have a guy knocking on the door in Quinton Byfield. So it leaves me wondering, who is necessarily going to win this spot? If anything, is Vilardi really going to give them a run for their money? I don't know, but it's going to be fun. And Turcotte, I want to know your initial thoughts on him, because his playmaking ability is just simply sublime, and I think he is definitely going to wow plenty of people as soon as he hits the ice in the NHL.
Yeah, let's just touch a little bit on the Badgers first and foremost. What does it say about the Wisconsin Badgers when the team that was dead last in the Big Ten had the number 1 point scorer in Cole Caulfield in the Big Ten?
Yeah.
They were poorly coached. The overall team wasn't really deployed properly. Even though he had 26 points in 29 games, a lot of people who watched the game said, yeah, this guy probably could have gotten more. And as a result, now you have yourselves a guy who was signed on to the LA Kings. He's playing in Germany right now because a whole bunch of those guys were sent over to the DEL.
Yep.
But Alex Turcotte, to me, even back in his draft year, was a guy that just kind of rose up the rankings because he was taken out early on. He had an injury. He suffered, I think it was like half the year's worth of the draft season not playing. But then when he came back, he was a double point a game player. He overtook the top 6 of the US NTDP, quickly rose up the ranks once more, and eventually went 5th overall. He's a guy who, if you want to talk about overall ability as a hockey player, this is what Alex Turcotte does. His work ethic through the roof, his two-way game, his board play, it's very strong. He can play PK. He can play those grindy type board battle kind of engagements, and he still has that crazy good offensive flair to his game as well. Turcotte was a very highly touted prospect for a reason, and a guy who a lot of people, just like Gabriel Vilardi, said could probably go 3rd overall. He didn't, but hey, LA picking at number 5 got themselves a very good player. He's so good. He's so smart. He's very good at skating. He's got all these abilities that will help him towards becoming one of these top NHL centers. We said this about Arthur Kaliyev earlier with Peyton Krebs, but if an Arthur Kaliyev-like guy had the work ethic of an Alex Turcotte, Arthur Kaliyev would have been a top 4, top 5 pick. And so Alex Turcotte is a guy who definitely does exhibit everything there is to be good at when it comes to hockey, despite being only 5'11", 185 pounds.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I couldn't have said it better. He's a guy that really is going to be turning heads as soon as next season. I'm hoping for his sake that he does start in the AHL next year. I don't believe he'll get much of any AHL time just because of, even with the Badgers really having such a down year, he was just under point per game. He still had a very strong year. I think he can take that next jump fairly easily, but obviously time will tell. I shouldn't get too ahead of myself here. I'm just very excited for him nonetheless. But getting on to the guy that is definitely going to cause a lot of competition. This is a guy that I can pretty confidently say he's never going to play an AHL game in his life, barring any injuries that happen for recouping. And that is Quinton Byfield. And Byfield is a guy where when everything was leading up to the draft, because you and I both have done plenty draft content, and for good reason, debating between him and Tim Stützle, who was the better player between the two, or the better fit for the LA Kings, if you will. I did a comparison video a couple months ago and really breaking down both players and their aspects of their game. And while they are vastly different in a lot of areas, I was favoring Stützle a little bit. And yes, it definitely went in part with what I was hearing at the time, that maybe the Kings would go down that route, as Stützle has that versatility to play the wing, which is definitely enticing for a team with this amount of center depth to possibly move him on the wing and whatever it may be. But then as we got closer to the draft, it seemed pretty committed. There was a report come out from a LA Kings reporter that has been spot on in previous years regarding who they were going to select, and he said it's going to be Byfield, no doubt about it, and it was just that. And Byfield, just on the forefront, before we even get to his statistics, he just has a great personality, an infectious character, is truly a leader in the locker room, and that's what I admire about him most. And that is why I think he's going to have such an easy transition into the NHL. I don't think anything's stopping him with such a great mentality that he already has. The Ceremon drafted in the first round back in 2020, obviously this year, 18 years old, 6'4", 215 pounds. There is some arguments to be had that he really isn't using his size to his full capability yet, and I would definitely agree there. He has taken advantage of it, but he can definitely get better with, say, his one-on-one game a little bit more. He can get caught stick lifted here and then, so it's those little things that he's going to quickly adapt to at the NHL level that he will be fine with. But in the OHL this past season, 82 points in 45 games, 32 goals, 50 assists. A year prior, 61 points in 64 games. Byfield, what really just wows on the forefront, obviously, is his speed. He's 6'4", over 200 pounds, and he's Chris Kreider-esque, in my opinion. And not to compare every guy's a Rangers, but I'm just thinking what is the best fit from my front of what I know best. And Kreider definitely stands out, whether he takes it down straight down the ice or along the boards. Byfield is very reminiscent in that sense. Longer strides, but he can make it happen. And that big body too, just his playmaking is just, when he gets in that offensive zone, he really slows down the game. He really looks like he's almost 2 steps ahead of everyone else. And it's really impressive, let alone given his size and just how fast-paced he is. So Byfield, what are your initial thoughts on him? What is your expectations for him as soon as next season in the NHL?
Well, getting back to the very original topic we were talking about, Byfield, Stützle, whatever. In my personal opinion, the gap between Lafreniere and Byfield was smaller than the gap between Byfield and number 3. And in fact, I didn't have Stützle as my number 3, to be honest. But
Did you have
I
Raymond?
will say, because, Stützle being a good point producer in the men's league definitely did give him some props there. But for Byfield, I had him over all these other guys because the potential with the Quinton Byfield is just so incredibly high. Cam Robinson on Twitter, he does stuff for Dauber Prospects. He referred to Quinton Byfield several times throughout a year as a unicorn. A guy you really never see. A guy who's 6'4", 214 pounds, but he dazzles around the ice like a ballerina. He skates like he's 5'11", and he plays the game like he's 5'11".
Yeah, he does.
But he's 6'4". This guy is a guy who you can't really outwork because his long strides, as you mentioned, it allows him to really get around the ice quickly. He's got a big frame that you can't really get the puck away from unless you're, actively cutting him off in front. And he's got some work to do on that department. But if this guy is able to start using his body effectively to the way that an Evgeny Malkin, for example, is able to in protecting the puck and allowing himself to create space, then this could be a very good player, very, very fast. He's already exhibited all the offensive tools to put him ahead of all the competition he's ever faced, from the York Simcoe Express at the U16 League to this limited time that he played in the junior A scene in Ontario, to his first year in the OHL where he was under a point per game, and then this season where he was at 2 points a game almost. There's so much potential here with the Quinton Byfield, who skates, who playmakes, who shoots, and who has an offensive mind like he does. So Obviously, you said it best at the very beginning here. He develops in, or if he has the ability to develop into this big power forward like game, which he isn't yet, but the potential is there. This could really be the true embodiment of what it means to be an LA King hockey player,
Yep.
especially going into the long term future.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it just made so much more sense with the Kings going for him. And yes, they are in a new wave here. They aren't the Kings of old. This isn't the same LA Kings team or core group for the most part that was the ones in their time in 2012 and 2014. Yes, they have those pieces, but it's not the same mentality. But even then, it's just ironic how they've kind of fallen in those same footsteps unintentionally.
Mm-hmm.
They've lucked out to be in this position with the Quinton Byfields of the world, and even Gabriel Vilardi. They took a little bit of a stretch on per se, but outside of that, they really just have been in the right spot and at the right time, nothing more than that. So it is fun to think about it in that sense. And Byfield is a guy where he's just going to add to the endless, and I'll touch on this in other videos, as I'm sure you will, with the type of Calder race we will probably see next season.
Mm-hmm.
It is probably one of the most diverse that we could think of, at least in recent years, between so many guys that are, say, coming from the KHL, whether it's, Sorokin, Shesterkin, technically still, Kaprizov, etc., the more seasoned rookies, if you will. And then you have these big name guys in Lafreniere, Byfield, Turcotte, the list goes on and on. A lot of things to be excited about, but the Canes are definitely going to have multiple guys that are going to make a good running to be in that spot for the Calder as soon as next season. But next up now, we have Helge Grans. And Grans is a guy where there's been a lot of talk about him and leading up to the draft and where he was exactly going to land. My good friend Steven, Statboy Steven, who I've had on the channel plenty, he's a scout, he's a prospect guru. He lives in Vienna, Austria, and he goes all around Europe scouting, meeting all these players. Like, he's met most of these players on this list I've just talked to you about. He's just awesome. And he has always been a big fan of Grans from everything that he has told me. And he ends up landing to the Kings in the second round. 18 years old, defenseman, 6'2", 183 pounds. And in the SHL thus far this season, he has 6 points in 11 games, including 2 goals and 4 assists. The year prior, in this 2019-2020 season, he had 3 points in 21 games. Grans is a guy where I don't necessarily know what his ceiling is, but he is one that definitely stood out as to being higher on draft boards for a guy in a offensively heavy draft, no question about it. So to see him land in that second round, still not even fall to the third, was impressive in my mind. So what was your initial thoughts on Grans? And he does make perfect sense for LA, as they definitely need this defensive depth.
Helge Grans to me was a lot more of a safer pick, and it's kind of why he kind of dropped down a little bit on the draft ranking. Some people had him, I know, earlier in the year as a probable, maybe first round caliber talent. I know some people towards the end said, okay, maybe he goes in the middle of the second round. But at the end of the day, what you're getting with Helge Grans is a really smooth skating kind of transitional defenseman, a guy who actually has been starting to produce points a lot more. 6 points, 11 games played now in the SHL. Huge step up from what he did in 2019-20 in his draft year. Now, he was a point per game at the junior 20 super elite level, and he does have some work to do when it comes to his overall defensive decision making. But the raw tools that a Helge Grans does have, hey, they're pretty good. I can honestly see him maxing out as probably a top 4 defenseman in his prime. He has a right-handed shot, so maybe have him alongside of that Tobias Bjornfot we talked about earlier. That'd be a very interesting Swedish combo on the blue line over there. But he's a big guy. He skates well for, again, just like the Quinton Byfield we just talked about. Even though he is over 6'2", he still has some pretty good strides and some pretty good mobility. So he's a guy who definitely does have a very interesting profile, and I'd be very interested in seeing how he goes forward when he makes that transition to the AHL and eventually the NHL, because I think he's probably going to be a player. It's just depending on how high his ceiling is, that will determine whether he's top 2, top 4, top 6, whatever. At the very least, I think he at least makes the show sometime in his long career.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to summarize him and to really point out his offensive production has been off the charts in regards to his previous year in the SHL, really taking that next jump, 6 points in 11 games, as we mentioned. Definitely something to be excited about, and as you mentioned, a safer pick, which I can definitely get along the lines of. And again, this LA Kings team, they have been so offensively heavy in this prospect pool. It made sense for them to land a guy like Grans, even with some even arguably better players available on the offensive side of things in the second round. We can definitely make the argument that they were looking for more of a positional need here, but for good reason. So next up, we have another defenseman and a guy that I do not have as much familiarity with as you probably do, and that's Brock Faber. Brock originally drafted in the second round, 18 years old this past year as well, 6 foot, 193 pounds. In the USHL this past season, had 9 points in 19 games, including 1 goal and 8 assists. The year prior had 10 points and 34 assists. Brock just adding more defensive depth. As you can see, the LA Kings land with not just 1 but 2 defensemen in the second round. You'd have an idea that yes, they are trying to fill this need, and for good reason. So what are your initial thoughts on Faber?
Well, I know, honestly, because I'm a Canucks guy, one of my buddies, his name is Chris Faber. He does a whole bunch of stuff for Canucks prospects and all that. He made an article about Brock Faber because they share the same last name, so he was very intrigued by the prospect.
As he should.
But at the end of the day, it was kind of ironic because even though he made the article mostly because of the last name, at the end of the day, Brock Faber is a very, very weird yet projectable kind of play style. He's very dynamic as a defensive shutdown defender. And you don't really hear that combo thrown together, dynamic shutdown defender, all too often. But he's a guy who in his own zone, he really thrives. He can get the puck away from guys. He can really nicely send it up and break up defensive transitions back the other way. He's a strong hockey player and a guy who definitely does have a path to go down because he's going over to the University of Minnesota Golden Gophers for 2020, 2021. I think some NCAA teams already laid out when their schedules are going to be starting. So we'll see how exactly that goes forward throughout the next few weeks. But for Brock Faber, as a guy who didn't really produce all too much with the NTDP this most previous season, I'm expecting a little bit of a jump up because once this guy's in a position where he's not playing behind the Jake Sandersons and the Tyler Clevens and all that, he'll be in a position where he can get himself a lot more playing time, a lot more ice time, a lot more offensive vision. And we'll see how exactly that translates because this guy's really dynamic when it comes to breaking down the play, and his skating's pretty good too. So I'm very excited for Brock Faber, to be honest.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, that is pretty funny what your friend did there. And luckily for his sake, he picked a player that actually does have a fairly promising future. So it's not like it's just anybody with his last name. So that is pretty neat. But last but not least here on this list, and this player is no longer considered a prospect, but I thought he'd be the perfect guy to cap off this video, and that is none other than Lias Andersson.
Oh, man.
Lias Andersson. What can I say? As a Rangers,
I'll let you take the floor for this one. Yes.
As a Rangers fan, I believe just on the forefront, both sides were at fault. I don't believe that one was heavier than the other. There were a lot of things that were misconstrued through the media, and there were a lot of things going on that weren't factually correct, among other things. And look, it is what it is at the end of the day. The New York Rangers back in 2017 were locked on Elias Pettersson, and the Vancouver Canucks decide, hey, we really are too, and we're getting him at 5. You're smart for that. I don't blame you for doing that. Luckily, at the time for me, I didn't focus on prospects nearly as much as I did now, so I wasn't as upset as I am now looking back. But the Rangers decided to go with the second best centerman in their minds as a Swedish man, and that is Lias, obviously. And Lias had a lot of hype to begin with, mainly because he was viewed as the true core piece of this rebuild that was beginning. For a Rangers team that has not been in a rebuild in basically a decade, is not accustomed to this, us New York fans in general, were very antsy, and we definitely get above ourselves with anything else. So Lias coming in the mix as our top first round pick, and who knows how long, because Glenn Sather traded them away every year. He comes in and things just don't work out, and he ends up getting traded finally. He was asking for a trade for the longest time, but the Rangers just couldn't get a deal done. There were rumors about him with Jesse Puljujärvi. You touched on that as well. That definitely didn't seem like it was going to come to fruition, because I guarantee the Rangers would have went down that route if it was, say, a 1-for-1. I don't think that ever presented itself. There was more than that the Rangers weren't willing to do. But regardless, Lias gets traded in this year's draft for the LA Kings pick that ends up becoming Will Cooley, I believe, for the Rangers. And Lias, he's still 22 years of age, originally drafted 7th overall in 2017. 5'11", 190 pounds. This year thus far in the SHL has had a strong start. 6 points in 8 games, including 2 goals and 4 assists, playing for HV71. In the AHL, NHL, and SHL last season, which is as bizarre as it is, and can really give you a good idea as to how much this guy has went through and really how up in the air things have been with his relationship with the Rangers. He started off the year with the NHL. I saw Lias in his home opener last year. I saw him trip on the ice when he tripped over the cord. I don't know if you saw.
Oh, really? You saw that live?
Yeah,
nice.
I was there. he had 1 point in his first 17 games, and all of us Ranger fans were advocating for him to get top six minutes. But clearly, we weren't seeing the full side of the story. We just wanted to see our prospect flourish. Then he goes to the AHL, has 5 points in 13 games. A lot of controversial things happening there. There's reports of, say, him being bullied or whatever it may be, or at least mistreated at the North American level, which I think was probably the case of just misunderstandings per se, with not understanding certain norms. I think that presented itself because the Rangers definitely have a great locker room, a better experience in the AHL over these past 2 years than what they did beforehand. Because when Chris Drury really came in as a GM for the Wolfpack, he really revamped things for them in that front. So I don't, granted, I could be wrong, but I don't think there was anything too detrimental there. So Lias ends up, screw this, I'm leaving. He flees to the SHL, just doesn't even call him nothing. And he goes to the SHL and he puts up 12 points in 17 games. So regardless, he's had great numbers throughout his entire career in the SHL. He continues that thus far this season. Gets dealt, gets a change of scenery, and there's definitely some things going on here because, as my buddy Steven touched on, one of the trainers for the LA Kings, or one of their scouts, is Lias's, I'm trying to think, is it Lias's father or his uncle?
There was a relationship there. I think I saw that one as well.
There's definitely a connection there, which is exactly why he got dealt there. And it seems like a good fit on the forefront when you look at how much of a Swedish wave they've had over these past couple years in the draft. I think that was another influencer as well to help with that intellect aspect, just help gel things and hope that Lias could possibly, probably have a bottom six role at this point with a guy who has a strong two-way game. It's just a matter of putting it together because his skills are so raw, and yes, we know the maturity level may not be there, to say the least. So what are your thoughts on Lias with everything just transpiring with him, and how do you think he will fit in this LA Kings lineup as soon as next year, per se?
My thoughts on Lias Andersson have changed over the past few years because I remember back when he was drafted, I was like, okay, this guy's going to be, I kind of had like a similar mindset to you. I was like, this guy's going to be a top six PK two-way forward. He's going to be a nice player for the Rangers going into the long-term future, maybe like a 60-point caliber guy, but a number one penalty kill specialist because that's the kind of determination and grit that this guy brings. But as the years went on, we kind of know what happened there. The silver medal got tossed into the stands. Everybody was like divided on that. Oh, it means he's very passionate about winning. Oh, it means he's unsportsmanlike. Both can be true. You could debate whether or not. But going into the long-term future, because Lias Andersson is already 22 years old and he already is in a position where he's proving himself as a very good, capable player in the position he is in, which is the SHL right now. The next step, the very natural next step, is to try this guy out in the NHL, see how he works. If you don't play him at center, because he got a lot of centers, play him on the left wing. Give him an opportunity to really showcase himself off in the ways that the New York Rangers system probably didn't allow him to. And we'll see how exactly that goes forward, because we have noted his time span is a little bit shorter than the rest because he is a little bit older at this point. But at the end of the day, a 22-year-old still can become a very capable middle six forward in the NHL. It's just really dependent on how the LA Kings are going to groom this guy into that role. They do have a few other wingers, though. Carl Grundstrom is another Swedish guy that we can definitely touch on. As we mentioned, Samuel Fagemo, too. So the overall Swedish connection there, we hinted at it.
And Kempe as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Kempe's there, too. There definitely is a Swedish connection there. So we'll see if Lias Andersson can be a very big contributor to that, because over the past few seasons, he has been good in U20 tournaments and in the SHL too. It's just taking that next step in North American play full time, and now with LA instead of New York. We'll see what happens there.
Yeah, and it definitely seems like this works out, obviously, for both sides. I think the Rangers got a better return than what I initially thought that they would have gone, so I'm sure that's why they executed when they did. I'm not upset at all. I'm happy that relationship has come to an end, because it just felt like an ongoing saga for a guy who really didn't necessarily deserve to be in that position, to have such a saga for a guy who hasn't even been, say, a star in the NHL. We're seeing all this drama. If we're going football, it's like Odell Beckham with the Giants. It's like, no, that isn't the case with Lias. He's just a prospect that hasn't fully developed yet, and yet he was always the center point, and he will be the blemish for the New York Rangers when it comes to really their decisions since starting the rebuild. He will be that one glaring spot. But outside of that, Lias, I do hope the best for him, obviously. I think he will have a strong spot starting next year to have something with the LA Kings in that bottom six role, round out his game, and flourish with a new change of scenery and just a completely different vibe in LA. So time will tell, but we'll see what happens there. But before I let you go, Gio, because I know we're running over an hour now, is there any other players or prospects in particular you would like to touch on that I have not mentioned?
First off, I mean, for the joke, I guess we could talk about Alex Laferriere.
Oh, yeah.
He's a very interesting one. I've been very interested in him just because of his name. Very,
Obviously.
Yeah,
I wanted the Rangers
obviously.
to draft him for the chuckles.
Yeah, I remember like when he was drafted, everybody on Twitter was kind of freaking out. Oh my gosh, they got Alex Laferriere. He's a guy who was over a point per game in the USHL, going over to the Harvard University Crimson. So we'll see how he does. He boasts a pretty interesting skill set. Nothing I would say is like too elite, but at the end of the day, pretty nice point producing player. Also, I wanted to touch on Adrian Kempe a little bit because for Adrian Kempe, he's a guy who is a little bit on that younger side as well. But I remember watching Kempe back, I think it was in the 2016 Calder Cup finals, or not. Yes, something like that, where he was playing against, this was the Manchester Monarchs, I believe. Yeah, not even the Ontario Reign, against the Utica Comets. And I was watching those games live. This Kempe guy was an absolute pain in the beehive. This guy was very good, just absolutely scoring goals everywhere. And he eventually helped the LA Kings farm team win that Calder Cup championship. So I was very upset watching that a few years ago. But now seeing him in a position where he's getting consistently 30 points in a year, and in a spot where he is 24, he's got a lot of room to grow. So Kempe is a guy that I've had my eye on for bad reasons because he eliminated my team in the finals a few years ago. But yeah, big respect for Adrian Kempe as well.
He's a guy where, I think that there is more left in the tank. I don't think we have yet to see his peak, if you will. Because when Kempe really burst on the scene, he has fallen a little bit off since when he really debuted in the NHL, but he does have the skill set, and he has definitely shown flashes of brilliance at times. It's just between the offense around him, obviously, maybe some attitude issues in there. I could be wrong on that part. But I think the consistency level, for the most part, just hasn't been there. There's definitely games where I've watched him where I'm definitely questioning his drive. It's like, okay, he has the package, but can he just put this out on a nightly basis? That I'm unsure of. So if Kempe can, in fact, debut that and really have that for the Kings as soon as next season per se, then who knows? Maybe he will get an increased opportunity because he is on the outside looking in with these other guys, if you will, that are surely going to be competing for a top 9 spot. So we will see what happens with Kempe. It is a funny story nonetheless. And talking about AHL, just staying on that topic before I let you go, I did see Lias multiple times playing for Hartford. And when I did, he definitely stood out at times. He definitely, when he felt comfortable, which definitely was not often, he stood out. But the biggest issue with him, and I drove us nuts, my family and I, one of the games we went to last year, the Wolfpack were winning. I believe it was with just 2 minutes left in the game. Elias decides to take an obnoxious penalty. And my boy Igor Shesterkin gives up a snipe, and then they go to overtime, and then they lose. So it's one of those things where I believe it was back-to-back nights, too, where Elias had a crucial penalty towards the end of the game that cost Hartford. So it goes both ways, if you will. The discipline has definitely been an issue with Elias, no question. And it was very interesting to see that with my own eyes, forefront. And I know things are different in the AHL, but it just kind of gave me an idea as to, okay, he's definitely raw in aspects of his game. He's definitely, trying a little too hard here and getting his frustration out. It seemed obvious. But again, we'll see what happens with Elias. I just wanted to touch on that because I have seen him play in person numerous times already in his young career. But
yeah, that's a great detail there.
Yeah, no, it was interesting. I definitely enjoyed watching Igor more than I did Elias. But yeah, no, I think we covered everything. And just to summarize again, this LA Kings team, you and I both are not necessarily LA Kings fans in particular, but we are definitely admirers, if you will, and for good reason. They have made a lot of great moves. Luc Robitaille has looked out quite a bit, but at the same time, he has landed a lot of good situations here for them. And the Kings are in a spot now where over these next 5 years, a lot of these guys are going to blossom, and they're going to continue to add to this prospect pool for at least the next 2 years. And some very interesting drafts, if you will. And I'm pretty sure you've already started touching on the 2021 draft. So it's going to be exciting to see what happens with them over this next year. I expect a lot of development. I think the Kings are going to be a team that surprises some people, given if they kind of ride hot how they did towards the end of last season. Ride hot, would say if Byfield really plays to expectations in his rookie year, same thing could even be said with Turcotte. Before you know it, the Kings could very well be, I don't see them making playoffs, but I see them in a similar situation to the Rangers where they will just be competing just pesky enough to basically push some teams off the cliff, if you will, that are on the come up of trying to make playoffs. They're not going to be easy. They're still going to be the big, the bad, the Kings with a lot of these younger guys that are coming up. But, I think that's it for this video. If there's anything else you want to touch on, go ahead and make sure to let us know your handles, of course, where everyone can find you that are watching.
Well, yes, that's actually a great segue there. I'm pretty fulfilled with what we talked about here. I liked the discussion we had. You can find me on YouTube at youtube.com/leggorocks99 gaming, or you can just search up leggorocks99 on the search bar. The channel name is just that. On Twitter, I'm LR99 gaming. And other than that, that's pretty much it. So, Tyler, it was great having you over here on talking about LA Kings prospects. As you mentioned, definitely not a Kings guy first and foremost, but I do admire everything that they have done in terms of building their overall future. And I've noted this a few times as well. Probably just one last final comment. But in my own experience, LA fans are the kindest fans in the comment section out of all the fan bases that I usually interact with, because on my channel, I talk about a lot of Canucks stuff, a lot of Habs stuff, Red Wing stuff, sometimes Leafs, sometimes Senators, sometimes Kings as well. Canucks fans and Habs fans, they're nasty. And I think any Canucks or Habs fan would tell you that they're nasty. Red Wings fans, a lot of them get into super deep discussions once in a while. But LA fans, these guys are the ones who are always like, hey, thank you so much for making this video. I really appreciate it. They're so kind. And maybe that's just me being an outlier. Maybe they're not all too kind to anybody else. But to me, they've been very great. So to all the LA faithful watching this, hope you enjoyed this video. And yeah, Tyler, take it away.
Oh, well, normally I would agree with you if Alec Martinez didn't haunt my dreams, for the past how many years now.
Right.
So outside of that, I can get with that for sure. Kings fans are definitely not obnoxious, at least. During their heyday when they were having these cup runs is when you're most cocky and you have people hopping on the bandwagon. I haven't obviously always had great interactions with them, but things have been perfectly fine over these past 2 years. So something to consider, and then nothing against anyone personally. They're gonna have their phone with Martinez, and he's not even on the Canes anymore, so we could bury the hatchet there. But again, seriously, thank you so much, Gio, for coming on the channel. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to check out Gio's channel if you haven't already, and I will talk to you again soon, my man. And that's going to conclude this video, guys. Another episode of the series down. We're up to 5 episodes with teams with the brightest futures in all the NHL, and we are still just getting started. In the coming weeks, you're still going to see plenty more episodes. I'm reaching out to other people for collabs. Guys that you definitely know, or gals, we'll see what happens. But regardless, make sure to check out Lego's channel if you haven't already. Again, one of the best hockey YouTubers there is. Consistent content. If you're talking about a guy that comes out with things daily, with such a variety of things, not just discussing teams that he's interested in, make sure to check out his channel, hit that subscribe button and that notification bell. And if you enjoy this video, if you enjoy the series, make sure to let me know in the comments below and hit those buttons as well. It means a ton, guys. Help us get to 2,000 subscribers. I know we'll get there sooner than later because you guys are amazing. Can't believe I'm in this spot right now, but I have all of you to thank for it. So seriously, thank you all so much again, guys. It means a ton. And check out previous videos. We got plenty of content on the channel regarding my first redraft of the 2012 NHL draft. Make sure to check that out, among others. Thank you so much, guys, and I'll be back real soon.